The shovel blade bit into the caliche with a sound like a bone snapping in a dry throat. Silas Thorne didn't stop to wipe the stinging salt from his eyes, even as the Arizona sun hammered a rhythmic, molten pulse into the back of his neck. He was 6 feet deep in the belly of the Blackwater Wash, a place where the earth was less soil and more compressed regret. The grave was supposed to be empty, a hollow bed for a man named Elias Vance, who was currently sitting 10 yards away, leaning against a sun-bleached saguaro. Elias wasn't dead, but he was leaking, a dark, rhythmic stain spreading across his wool duster where a .44 slug had found a home between his ribs. Silas heaved a lungful of dust and threw another spade of white earth over the rim, the grit coating his tongue like powdered lye. He hadn't spoken to the man he was burying in 3 hours, not since the horses had bolted and left him with 1 canteen and a single rusted shovel. The silence between them was an old thing, a thick, suffocating shroud woven from a decade of shared sins and silent betrayals. Every time the shovel hit a rock, the jarring vibration traveled up Silas's scarred forearms, echoing the phantom ache of the war they had both tried to outrun. A sharp metallic clink stopped Silas's heart before it stopped his arms. It wasn't the dull thud of stone or the scrape of hard clay. It was the unmistakable ring of iron hitting iron. He froze, his breath hitching in a chest that felt like it was filled with jagged glass. He looked over at Elias, whose head was lolling against the cactus needles, his eyes half closed and filmed with the milky haze of the fast-approaching end. Elias didn't notice the sound, or if he did, he no longer had the currency of breath to care. Silas dropped to his knees in the pit, his fingers clawing at the loose dirt like a starving dog. He expected a rock, a buried gear from a rusted wagon, or perhaps a discarded chest from the raids. Instead, his fingernails snagged at rotted hemp and the rough, unmistakable texture of a pine lid. The wood was soft, swollen with some subterranean moisture that shouldn't exist in this parched hell. He cleared a patch the size of a dinner plate, revealing a knot in the wood that looked like a blind, staring eye. He didn't want to open it, but the debt he owed the man above ground was smaller than the curiosity burning in his marrow. He used the tip of the shovel to pry at the edge, the wood groaning and splintering with a wet, visceral shriek. The lid gave way all at once, releasing a gust of air that smelled of ancient cedar and something sharply metallic, like a copper penny resting on a tongue. Inside the coffin lay a man in a black suit, his skin preserved into a dark, translucent parchment that stretched tight over a high-set jaw. Silas stared down at the face, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The dead man wasn't a stranger. He was wearing the silver vest chain Silas had sold to a pawnbroker in El Paso 5 years ago to pay for a bottle of rye and a night of forgetting. More than the chain, it was the scar, a jagged lightning bolt running from the left temple down to the corner of the mouth. Silas reached up and touched his own face, tracing the identical ridge of scar tissue that mapped his own history of violence. "Find something worth keeping, Silas?" Elias's voice was a wet rattle, barely cutting through the shimmering heat waves. Silas looked up, his vision swimming. Elias was watching him now, a crooked, bloody grin splitting his face. The power in the wash shifted in a heartbeat. The man in the hole was no longer a grave digger, and the man on the surface was no longer a victim. Silas felt the weight of the secret he had buried in his own mind beginning to heave upward, cracking the surface of his composure. "There's a man down here, Elias," Silas said, his voice sounding like a stranger's. "He's wearing my chain. He's wearing my face." Elias let out a hacking cough that sprayed crimson onto the white dust between his boots. "Maybe the earth just got tired of waiting for the real thing. Maybe it decided to grow one of its own." Silas climbed out of the grave, his boots heavy with the white clay of the wash. He stood over Elias, the shovel gripped so tight his knuckles was white as the caliche. He almost swung the spade then, almost ended the rattle in Elias's throat to keep the silence pure. His muscles bunched, the heat of the sun merging with the boiling fluid in his veins. Elias didn't flinch. He just looked at the shovel with a weary sort of invitation. The moment stretched, a taut wire between them, humming with 10 years of unspoken accusations. Then a hawk shrieked overhead, a sharp, lonely sound that broke the spell, and Silas lowered the iron blade. "You knew he was down there, Silas," Silas hissed, leaning down until he could smell the rot and the cheap tobacco on Elias's breath. Elias gripped Silas's forearm, his fingers surprisingly strong, cold as well water despite the blistering heat. For a second, it looked like he might pull Silas into a final desperate embrace, or perhaps a strangling hold. They remained locked like that, two statues of grit and blood. The grip loosened as Elias's strength flickered. "I didn't pick it, Silas. The wash picks what it wants. I just followed the smell of the rot." He slumped back, his breathing turning into a series of shallow, desperate hitches. Silas stood up and looked back into the hole. The man in the coffin seemed to be watching them both, a silent witness to a conversation that started in a burning barn in 1864 and was only now reaching its conclusion. A low rumble vibrated through the ground, a rhythmic thudding that Silas first took for his own pulse. Then he saw the dust cloud on the eastern ridge, a rolling wall of yellow grit that signaled the arrival of the vultures. Not the birds, but the men who followed the scent of Elias Vance's blood, the Calloway brothers. They were coming for the ledger Elias tucked into his boot, a book filled with the names of every judge and lawman who took a cut of the rail yard robberies. Silas looked at Elias, then at the horizon. He had enough time to mount the roan if it returned, or to run on foot into the jagged teeth of the canyon. He almost turned towards the north, almost left Elias to the mercies of men who peeled skin like orange rinds. His foot shifted in the dirt, the instinct for survival screaming in his ear. But the dead man in the grave seemed to pull his shadow to him, a weight that surpassed fear. "Give me the book, Elias," Silas demanded, his hand hovering over the grip of his peacemaker. "If they find it on you, they'll burn this whole wash just to make sure the ashes don't talk." Elias reached for his boot, his hand shaking so violently he could barely hook his thumb into the leather. Silas reached out to help him, his fingers brushing the cold, sweat-slicked skin of Elias's ankle. They almost touched, a rare moment of human contact in a decade of isolation. But the first rifle shot kicked up a fountain of dust between them. The bullet whined off a rock, the scream of lead cutting through the heavy air. Silas dived into the grave, landing hard on the pine lid of the coffin. The wood groaned again, but held. From the bottom of the pit, the sky was a narrow strip of blinding blue, crossed by the occasional silhouette of a Calloway rider on the rim. Silas pulled his revolver, the oil on the cylinder smelling of lemons and death. He looked at the dead man in the coffin, the twin of his own soul, and felt a sudden sickening clarity. The twist didn't come from the riders or the blood. It came from the chain.
Silas reached down and snagged the silver links from the corpse's vest. As the dirt fell away, he saw the engraving on the fob, "To Captain Silas Thorne for valor at Franklin." Silas felt the world tilt. He remembered the fire in the barn, the smoke so thick he couldn't see his own hands. He remembered the man screaming in the corner, the man he had left behind to save his own skin, the man whose name he had stolen to start over in the West.
The man in the coffin wasn't a twin. He was the real Silas Thorne. The man in the grave was the hero. The man standing on top of him, breathing the hot Arizona air, was nothing but a thief named Arthur Miller, who had worn a dead man's life like a stolen coat for 10 years. Elias Vance hadn't been his war comrade. He had been the man who saw Arthur Miller peel the chain off the charred body. Elias hadn't been a friend. He had been a blackmailer who had owned Arthur's soul one whiskey bottle at a time. A second shot shattered the edge of the pine lid, a splinter of wood slicing Arthur's cheek. He didn't feel the pain. He was staring at the corpse, seeing the life he had murdered twice over. Above him, Elias was laughing, a high, thin sound that was quickly drowned out by the thunder of galloping hooves. The Callaways were closing in, their shouts carrying on the wind like the barking of hounds. They didn't want the ledger. They wanted the man who knew where the money from the last job was buried. Arthur realized then that Elias had never intended to die quietly. He had led the Callaways here to witness the final unburying of the truth. Elias wanted to see Arthur Miller die in the same hole as the man he had robbed. Power shifted again. Arthur wasn't a protector anymore, and Elias wasn't a victim. They were both targets in a landscape that had finally run out of room for their lies. Arthur gripped the edge of the grave and hauled himself up, the revolver heavy in his hand. He saw the lead rider, a man named Mace Calloway, skidding his horse to a halt at the edge of the wash. Mace was a man built of gristle and bad intentions, his face hidden behind a grease-stained bandana. He looked at the grave, then at Arthur, then at the dying Elias. "Which one of you's gonna tell me where the El Paso gold is?" Mace shouted, his rifle leveled at Arthur's throat. "Because I only need one mouth, and I've got plenty of lead for the rest." Elias pointed a trembling finger at the grave. "Ask the man in the box, Mace. He's the only one around here who ever told the truth." Mace looked confused for a fraction of a second, his gaze flickering toward the open pit. In that heartbeat of hesitation, Arthur saw his chance. He didn't shoot Mace. He shot the canteen hanging from Mace's saddle. The explosion of water was a shock in the dry heat, a spray of diamonds that momentarily blinded the horse. The animal reared, throwing Mace backward into the dust. Arthur scrambled toward Elias, grabbing him by the collar of his duster. He almost hauled him toward the roan that had appeared at the edge of the brush, spooked but present. He almost whispered a confession, a final apology for the barn and the chain and the 10 years of stolen life. But Elias pushed him away, his eyes wide with a sudden feral light. "Go, Arthur," Elias hissed. "Go be a hero one last time." The other Callaways opened fire. The air became a solid wall of lead. Arthur felt a bullet tear through his shoulder, a hot iron brand that spun him around. He fell back toward the grave, his boots skidding on the loose rim. He saw Mace Calloway rising from the dust, his face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Mace wasn't going to shoot. He was going to stomp Arthur into the white clay. He charged, a human landslide of violence. Arthur didn't reach for his gun. He reached for the shovel. As Mace lunged, Arthur swung the heavy iron head with every ounce of his remaining strength. The edge caught Mace in the throat. a sickening crunch of cartilage that echoed through the canyon. Mace fell, not away from the grave, but directly into it. He landed on the pine lid with a crash, the rotted wood finally giving way completely. Mace and the real Silas Thorne disappeared into a tangle of splinters and ancient linen. The sight froze the remaining riders. It was a moment of pure visual horror, their leader swallowed by the earth in the arms of a ghost. Arthur stood on the edge of the pit, blood streaming down his arm, the silver chain dangling from his bloody fingers. He looked like a demon birthed from the Caliche, a man who had died and come back with the dirt still in his eyes. He didn't look at the riders. He looked at Elias, who was finally, mercifully silent. Elias Vance was dead, his eyes fixed on the blue strip of sky he would never reach. The ledger was tucked firmly in his boot, a ticking bomb of secrets that would now never be detonated. Arthur looked at the Callaways. They were younger men, hired guns who didn't have the stomach for a fight against a man who seemed to crawl out of his own grave. One by one, they turned their horses, the dust of their departure a silent admission of defeat. Arthur was alone in the wash with 3 dead men and 1 empty grave. The silence returned, heavier than before, the heat beginning to ebb as the sun dipped behind the jagged teeth of the western range. He walked over to Elias and closed his eyes, his touch surprisingly gentle. He didn't take the ledger, he didn't take the boots. He walked back to the grave and looked down at the wreckage. Mace was dead, his neck broken from the fall. The real Silas Thorne was finally being crushed by the weight of the world he had left behind. Arthur began to shovel the dirt back in. He didn't stop for the pain in his shoulder. He didn't stop for the darkness that was pooling in the shadows of the rocks. He buried the chain. He buried the hero. He buried the thief. He worked until the moon was high and silver, casting a cold, indifferent light over the fresh mound of white clay. There was no headstone. There was no prayer, just a flat patch of earth in a wash that didn't appear on any map. He caught the roan by the bridle, the horse shivering under his touch. He didn't mount. He couldn't. His body felt like a house that had been gutted by fire, the walls still standing, but the heart turned to ash. He began to walk toward the north, away from Oakhaven, away from the name of Silas Thorne, away from the ghost of Arthur Miller. He had no name now, no history, and no destination. He was just a shape moving through the desert, a shadow that the light had forgotten to claim. The wind picked up, whistling through the cigar roll needles with a sound like a distant haunting flute. It carried the smell of rain from a storm 100 miles away, a promise of water that would never reach the Blackwater Wash. Arthur didn't look back. If he had, he would have seen the white dust settling over the grave, erasing the last traces of the man who had arrived to bury someone who wasn't dead, and ended up burying the only part of himself that mattered. The night was deep and cold when he reached the edge of the territory. He stopped at a small creek, the water a black ribbon under the stars. He knelt and washed the blood and the caliche from his face, the water stinging like 1,000 tiny needles. He looked at his reflection in the dark pool. The scar was still there, a jagged line of silver in the moonlight. It was the only thing he had left that was truly his. He didn't look like a hero. He didn't look like a thief. He just looked like a man who had finally stopped running. He stood by the water until the sky began to turn that sickly bruised gray that precedes the dawn. He felt the weight of the years pressing down on him, a physical burden that made every breath a labor. He almost wished the Callaways had finished it. He almost wished he was down in the pine box with the real Silas Thorne. But the world wasn't that kind.
It left you with the quiet. It left you with the haunting weight of the things you couldn't bury. He stood up, his joints popping like dry twigs. He took the roan's bridle and continued north. He'd find a town where no one knew his face. He'd find a job that required no names. He'd live a life of silence, a ghost in a world of living men. But he knew as the first ray of the sun hit the distant peaks that the dirt of the Blackwater Wash would never truly leave his skin. He was a man digging a grave and finding himself inside, and that's a hole you could never climb out of. The sun climbed higher, a cold golden disk that offered no mercy. Arthur Miller walked out of the boarding house and into the street. He didn't look back. He didn't have to. He was the man who had buried the hero, and that was a story that would follow him to the end of the world. He began to walk, his steps slow and deliberate, a silent prayer in every movement. The desert was waiting, and the silence was his only friend.
The story of the Blackwater Wash was over. The story of the man who survived it was just beginning. It was a story of silence and salt, of grit and blood, of a man who found himself inside a grave and had to learn how to live with the ghost. It was a quiet, heavy, and emotionally haunting story, a story that would never be told, but would always be felt in the heat and the dust and the long, shimmering haze of the Arizona Territory. Arthur Miller walked until the town was a memory, until the mountains were a blur, until the only thing left was the rhythmic thud of his boots against the hard-packed earth. He didn't whistle, he didn't sing, he just moved, a steady, mechanical progress toward a horizon that offered no welcome. The silence was his only companion, a faithful shadow that would follow him to the end of his days. And in the heart of the West, the dust continued to blow, covering the tracks of the man who had finally, painfully, run out of time. The final ray of the sun disappeared behind the peaks, leaving the world in a bruised violet light. The desert was still, the stars were bright, and the ghosts were finally at peace. Arthur Miller closed his eyes and let the darkness take the rest. He was home, and for a man with a secret like his, home was the only place left to go. The story was finished, but the weight of it remained, a lingering, haunting presence in the air that no wind could ever truly blow away.